this case, let's say it goes back to my committee. It's assigned to me. So then we, in the committee, the chair will set up a date for a hearing. And the hearing is published a week in advance. The chair has to have his calendar a week in advance so all the public can see what's coming up. So I have that bill on the calendar. And anybody that wishes to speak on that bill will notify the committee assistant. And there's rules for that. So most important thing is they have to have it in at least 24 hours before the committee. And up to 72 if it's a weekend. Anyway, you send your testimony in. All testimonies have to be in writing. And so that's submitted. And then let's say on Wednesday, we have the hearing. And Richard has submitted his testimony. He comes in and he stands at the podium. He's recognized to come forward. And he stands. And the one thing that we kind of cringe is when people come in and read their testimony, because the committee members will have seen those documents a day ahead of time so they can prepare for the meeting. They're interested in the meat and potatoes in that bill, so to speak. And then at that point, when you have finished, the chair will say, are there any questions? And the members one at a time are recognized to ask you questions. And now within the rules that I showed you, I have a rule that everybody will be treated with respect. And I can cut them off if I see that they are not treating our guest, the testifier, then I will cut them off. I've only had to do that a couple of times, but it can happen. But it's one of our rules. And as a side note, Robert's rules is used for, generally speaking, for groups under 50. Our house is made up of 125. So we have a different set of rules, and it's called the Mason's Manual. And it's used by larger groups such as our House Legislature and also in the US Congress. So the Masons rule will apply. If my rules don't cover it, then Masons does. And in one of my rules, I refer to Masons for decorum and so forth. Okay, now we've had our hearing. We have to wait at least 24 hours, generally speaking. We can break that rule with a vote, but generally speaking, you let that lie for 24 hours. And so we're coming back on Thursday. And I have announced, normally it'll be the next week, quite frankly, but let's say for this example, it's the next day. I have announced that we will be working that bill. And that's Richard's bill that we're working on that day. And this is the point where the audience and no one outside the committee will be involved in this process. The chairman will say, what is the will of the committee on House Bill 22? And one of the members would, whatever, will say, I recommend we pass this bill out favorably. And that's when the debate begins. And so members on the committee will debate back and forth, the pros, the cons, whatever, on the bill. And at some point, normally the chair can tell when we're kind of exhausted the debate. And at some point, some of them just want to argue among themselves over and over again, saying the same things. And I will say that's enough. I think we've reached a point where we can decide whether this bill moves forward or not. And so we'll call for a vote. Now, normally that vote is a voice vote. All in favor say aye, all opposed no. And by hearing, I'll say, okay, this bill will be passed out favorably. Now, someone could say, I want this bill referred out of our committee with no comment. And that's kind of like a death knell for that bill. So you're not recommending it at that point. And that's never a good thing, but it happens. it happens. Or they can defeat the bill at that point. If that happens in committee, that bill is dead. We'll go no further. But for this example, it passed out of committee. Now we go to the House floor. And this is where we are now with this bill. 125 members. Every day, the House meets at 11 a.m. We go in, and the first thing we do is the chaplain will give a prayer. She stands there. In our case, it's a she, and gives the prayer. After that, a House member is assigned to lead the Pledge of Allegiance. And they will stand either here on this side or this side. And in a loud voice, they'll say aye, and all the chamber will chime in and will say the Pledge of Allegiance. The Speaker of the House sits up here, and he'll call the meeting to order. Right here is the Majority Leader sits, the Speaker's chair on the floor, and then pro tem. My chair is this one right here. And unfortunately, I have to act like I'm paying attention all the time because of where I'm seated. The guys way back here, they can do homework, whatever they want to do, but I can't. So the Majority Leader will go to the podium here, and he will say, we want to have the Committee of the Whole. We want to dissolve the House and move into the Committee of the Whole. And the Speaker will say, all those in favor, aye, no. And at that point, the Speaker has normally prearranged for somebody in the House to replace him in that chair. And so then at that point, that person goes up to the chair, calls the meeting to order, and now it becomes a huge committee at that point. And so Richard's bill is up that day. And so myself or whoever brought the bill will go down front and explain the bill, give the merits, whatever, the arguments for passage of that bill. At that point, there will be others will be lighting up the screen. These screens there's one there and one over here. And that is where everybody's name appears. And if you want to speak, you push your button, the blue button that says bill. You want to speak to the bill. So on his screen up here, he will see what order they were pushed, and he will start calling out names. They will go down here, and they will speak either for it or against it. Or if they have questions, they'll call back. Whenever your person is here, the person that was there previously has to stand back over here on this side or this side. They cannot be anywhere near the podium when they're speaking, unless this person comes up and says, I want to speak to the carrier of the bill. So that person comes over here, and the two of them are standing here. And they'll start firing questions. And this person, they've done their homework, they're ready. So they'll answer all the questions. And then this person will say, that's enough. You've answered all my questions. And that person will leave then. And that person will finish their presentation, whatever they want to say. At this stage, this can go on for hours. And at some point, this person that carried it will go back to the podium and say, Mr. Chairman or Madam Chair, I move that this bill be passed. And at that point, a voice vote is taken. Now, a person in the audience can ask for a recorded vote. At that point, then everybody is required to push their button on their desk to vote up or down on that bill. So let's say it's passed. We're almost there. The next step is, and this is a requirement, that has to sit for 24 hours. We can come back the next day and have final action. That's when the bill is finally passed out of the House or the Senate. The speaker's in the chair, and he'll say final action on House Bill 22. At that point, this is no longer a voice vote. This is a recorded vote. This is the one in law that has to be recorded, and everybody's vote is known to the public. In the committee, I can ask if anybody wishes to have their vote recorded, and they can voluntarily have their votes recorded, and that does happen. When it's a sensitive bill, some people feel, I want my vote recorded so I can tell my constituents I voted either for or against that bill. So that bill's done at that point. And of course, there's rules. We have the rules of the House of Representatives. These are rules beyond what's in the Mason's Manual. And each one of us have a copy of this at our desk. And this covers all the nitty-gritty stuff about how you conduct yourself, and can you have food at your table, all that kind of stuff. Everything's in there. And if it's not in here, then we refer to Mason's Manual at that point. So when that happens, that bill is carried over to the Senate, to the other chamber. They go through the same process we did. Now it goes over to the Senate. And the Senate, the president of the Senate, will assign that bill to a committee. And they go through the exact same process as the House did. And that bill could die at any point. The bill to become law has to pass both chambers. So let's say they went through the whole process and they did a final action and it passed. Or they decided, and this is very common, the Senate doesn't like what we do, and we do the same to them. We may change one word in the bill and say we don't like it the way it's written, or they can add all kinds of amendments to it. They can do whatever they want. At that point, they will send that bill back with their changes, and we have to go over it. And we have to go through the process all over again, not through the committee, but on the House floor. And our decision then is to either concur with their changes, or we say we non-concur. At that point, it goes to conference committee. Conference committee is made up of 3 members from the House and 3 members from the Senate. Normally, those 3 members are the chair of the committee that it came out of, the vice chair, and the ranking minority person. So those 3 people. And depending if it's Senate bill or House bill, let's say we go into the conference committee. You sit across the table in one of these conference rooms, in that middle section there. You sit across from them, and if it's a House bill, a chair is in charge of the meeting. If it's Senate, they are. And at that point, you say, what's the will? And say, what's your problem with this? You know, the senator will say, you changed this. Why did you change that? We say, well, what you wrote stinks. It's terrible. We don't like it. Your job on that committee is to represent the House position. Their job is to represent the Senate position on that bill. So you will argue back and forth. No, let's not call it argument. Let's say we discuss it passionately. And these are open to the public as well. And you come to a point where you say, well, we can't decide this today. Let's schedule another meeting. And these meetings can go on for days, sometimes weeks. Normally, you can normally resolve your differences in 2 or 3 days. And when you're sitting there and they say, well, we want this in the bill. And at that point, I'll say, well, we wish to be excused for a few minutes. We'll go outside the room, the 3 of us on the House side, and we'll discuss what they said. And I've been known to call an expert to come out with us. And we'll ask him, what does this do in the law, whatever. And then we'll go back and we'll say that is totally unacceptable, or we accept that. So it's a back and forth, a little bit of trading action going on. So let's say we came up with the conference committee, we came to an agreement. Then it goes back to both the House and the Senate for another vote. The final vote, let's say it's yes on both sides to the conference committee report. Now that bill is ready to move on. We have rules for the joint committees. And this is how we're supposed to act when we're mixing it up with our counterparts across the rotunda. And we normally follow the rules. Some don't, but most do. Now the bill goes to the governor. The governor can either sign that bill, or she can not sign it and it will become law in 10 days. Or she can veto the bill. This is where it gets a little dicey, because once the governor has vetoed a bill, it has to go back to the legislature. And just a side note, this is why the legislature breaks in April. We take 2.5, 3 weeks off, and that gives all the attorneys down below a chance to write the bill as it's finished with all the amendments and everything, put it in the correct language and get it ready. Goes to the governor, and then at that point it comes back. She vetoes it. It comes back to the legislature, both the House and the Senate. Get the same bill. And if it's a House bill, we have to vote first. If it's a Senate bill, they vote first on the override. And it takes 2/3 vote to override the governor's veto. In the Senate, that's 27 votes. In the House, that's 84. If the veto stands, that's the end of it. That bill dies. If we override, both chambers override, then that bill becomes law. And they are sent off to the Secretary of State's where they're entered into the legal system and all of that. So let's stop right there for a moment. I'm not sure how I stopped sharing.
At the very top, you should see kind of an orange bar. Slide over to the left, and it says stop sharing.
It just tells me that I am sharing. Okay, there we go. So do we have any questions at this point on how a bill becomes law?
I have a question.
I have
Hear
a
me, Ron?
question.
Yes, Vi.
Oh,
Vi is
do I
first.
go first? Okay. At the point that I think that the committee would vote it, no, on the floor, it would vote it out. Then there is a 24-hour waiting period before the final action vote. What's the purpose of that?
It's a technical, it gives the staff time to prepare that bill for a vote, but it also is put in there so that the legislators have time to read that bill in total and get prepared for the final vote. Sometimes it happens, now we get towards the end of the session. This is where that rule comes in primarily, because they'll be in a hurry and they'll say, we got to do this right away. And then we'll say, well, there's the 24-hour rule. Let's not rush this. So, but it's primarily for the administrative to give them time to get it ready. But it also is a cooling off period, so to speak. Richard.
Yeah, what is a reasonable strategy for trying to get a bill through? Because it sounds like you really should have a lot of support before you even start writing the bill.
You're correct. If you want a bill passed in the legislature, you have a lot of work to get done. You are going to visit with the members of the committee first. That's the first step. So you're going to get as much support as you can on that bill. So let's say I am the one representing you on that bill. I will be talking to the committee members and saying, look, we really need this bill and here are the reasons why. And you'll know ahead of time whether you've got the votes or not. If you don't have the votes, it will probably never come up in the committee even. But so it gets a little dicey in the committees in that's where the actual work begins. You want a bill to go before the House and you want a favorable recommendation out of the committee, that's where your work is placed. Does that answer your question?
Well, it sounds like you almost have to do a lot of work ahead of time, even before you propose actually propose the bill to the committee, the reviser. It seems you've got to kind of be deciding whether you have support in general. And I'll give you an example.
Well, not necessarily. You can go ahead and get with the revisers and have the bill drafted, have it entered into the committee. But let's say one of the committee members come to me, they've got your bill and they say, okay, I need some time before you have a hearing on this bill. Let me work with the committee before I ask you to bring it up for a hearing. So that gives your proponent on the committee time to visit with the committee members and all of that. And if you're involved, then you have some time to visit with some of the folks also. And then at that point, the committee member will come to the chair and say, we're ready to have our hearing.
Okay, don't you
We
have
work
to,
together on this, so I'm good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
well, somebody has to introduce the bill for you, like either yourself or someone else. So obviously that person should be supporting what you want to do. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that person then is the one who will be your
So being
advocate.
representative, excuse me, you're breaking
Say
up
that
on me
again.
because my system's breaking up a little bit, but
Yeah.
it doesn't have to necessarily be your representative, because you have to find a representative that actually supports your position, correct?
Right, right. It does not have to be your representative.
Okay.
You just have to find somebody that supports it and is willing to go through this process with you.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
Now, do all bills like this start in the House, or could they also start in the Senate?
They can start either place.
Okay.
And if it starts in the Senate, it'll have a Senate bill number on it. Now, in special cases, there are times when, like Senator Longbine and I put identical bills in both chambers. And Alma wanted to buy the other half of that lake. The state owned half of their lake that they used for water. So we both put in the same bill, identical bills. A couple changes made, but we got it through the process. And when it got to the other chamber, they said, well, this is the same bill we have. We'll just pass the Senate bill or we'll just pass the House bill, whichever one. But it went through both chambers at the same time. That's kind of rare, but it does happen. If you feel it's real important, you get your senator to help you out, and they normally will.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was good.
Okay, everybody, any more questions? Then let's move on. Normally on Columbus Day event like this, we will move over from the committee room over to the House chamber. And we will normally have a guest speaker. Well, that guest speaker today is me. I've been asked to give a bit of an update on where we are with water. So here we go again. I have been pestering leadership for a couple of years about we need to do something about water in the state of Kansas. and I was chair of the Agriculture Committee. And he called me November last and he said, you know, you've been pestering me about this, so I'm creating a committee called Water Committee, and I'm putting you in charge of it. And you have 2 years to solve the problem. I did not know what I was getting myself into. But I was visiting with some friends about this, and this lady mentioned, you know, a real good motto or a slogan for this would be to stop the drop. So I'm going to keep it. I like it. In both, we want to stop the drop in both the aquifers and the dam capacities, which are a problem, and I'll share that with you. So how complicated is this issue? Each color represents a different office or agency that has something to do with water. There are 16 of them. And I just about decided to resign at that point. It's complicated. This many people involved with water. And then you go one step further. And I said, well, how much overlap is there? Well, look at that. Everywhere you see colors going all the way across, there's overlap between different agencies. It's a minefield trying to get anything done related to water in this state. It's confusing. They do a good job. I'm not criticizing them. They do a pretty good job, but for an outsider, anybody out wanting to know what goes on inside the water, it's very difficult to get the information. Now we're not done with the complication. Let's add in the feds. There are 7 different agencies involved with water in our state. So we spent the entire session just gathering information. We called in a representative from every one of those 16, and most of the federal agencies came in, and I asked every one of them, I want to know what your mission statement is, what your job is, how you do it. I want to know how much money you spend, and who do you report to? Well, the last one was interesting. Some of them couldn't answer that question, and that presents a problem. So it's complicated. After the session ended, I requested through leadership, I said, I want to have a summer meeting with my committee. At that point, it's called an interim meeting. I'm going to take my committee clear to Western Kansas, Garden City. And I got approval for that. So we went to Garden City. We had a committee meeting. And these are the things we discussed. We discussed water quality and quantity. And in Western Kansas, we're talking about the aquifers. There's the Ogallala, the Great Bend Prairie, and Equus aquifers that cover that part of the state. A side note, there's been an excellent book written called Running Out. The author of that book called and asked if he could attend the meeting. And we said, most certainly. So he came to the meeting as well. That book is now on the New York Times bestsellers list. But very interesting visiting with him. He grew up out there, as did I, but he grew up in Southwest Kansas. And in his book, he tied together the history, his family, and then all of the problems with water. It was a fascinating book. But let's get back to where we were. Everything in red are notes that I made to myself after the meeting, things that we learned. There is uranium contamination in the water supply along the Arkansas River, and now also in the aquifer. We went and visited the uranium removal plant in Lake, Kansas. They identified the uranium there and they had to get rid of it. They spent $6 million. So their water is expensive out there now. They removed the uranium. They had to dig a well over 6,000 feet deep. So that uranium then is injected back into the earth below the rock layers, so it never gets back into the water supply. But what we found, there is a depletion of the aquifer, so we're depleting the water reserves that we have in western Kansas, and southwest Kansas is probably in the worst shape right now. The depletion is critical in some areas. There are some what are called locally enhanced management areas, LEMAs, that are demonstrating conservation techniques that are dramatically slowing the depletion. We visited a technical farm. They're small in number, but these folks have volunteered to try some experimentation on their farms. They place a probe down into the soil 48 inches deep. And we're talking about irrigators now. And on their phones, their iPhones, their smartphones, they can control when that water goes on, when it turns off. And the probes tell them what area is ideal for the growth of that crop, this much water. And they have been able to slow up to 20, in some cases up to 40% of their water usage, and demonstrate not only better yield, but more profit. So that we need to highlight all over that area of the state so that we can get everyone involved in it. Now we think Eastern Kansas, nothing to worry about here, but that's false. We are losing dam storage capacity, which affects both controlling floods, because we can't hold as much water back. It also is affecting how much water is available to move on down for those cities that use that water. And that could become a problem, because where's all the growth in our state? It's between Saline and Kansas City. And so that population, and now we have to worry about businesses too. People that want to locate to our state, they want to know about the future of the water and will we have enough? So let me say one thing first here before we go any further. There is no blame to be cast out. At the time all the water rights were given, nobody knew that was supply would go away, but it has dropped significantly. So we have to deal with it. We're not going to blame people, we're going to deal with it. So in Eastern Kansas, we have the dam capacities, population increase. Southeast Kansas is primarily a flooding issue, but we still have to deal with it and conserve, and conservation is also needed. Let me stop right there and see if we have any questions.
Ron?
Yes.
It's Harley. I guess the one issue I was involved with was I think all of the reservoirs you're talking about, mostly Corps of Engineers, the bigger ones. The water we're taking out is what was provided for sediment storage. The flood protection comes from where the spillway is up, and all of those are just fine. I know this came up, the uranium thing came up in Pittsburgh, and the bottom line is they built a water supply reservoir. Am I wrong now we are using these sediment pools for water, but that's not what they were designed for.
They were designed for flood control and for water consumption. They were designed for both. And in some cases, some of them also have hydroelectric production as well, which is non-consuming. There's something else I was going to say and I forgot. I have spoken with law professors that their whole life is water law, and also a practitioner of law in Western Kansas that practices only water laws. And all of them tell me do not mess with the Kansas water laws. You may tweak it, but don't be changing it. Kansas is recognized as having some of the best water laws in the country. And I need to further explain that just a bit. Our state you have the right to use the water. In other states, you own the water. Let's say, take Texas, for example. They have their law says you own the water beneath your property. And so some of those folks down there are pumping that water to cities nearby or wherever. They're selling that water, which is depleting the aquifers rather rapidly. But in Kansas, you have the right to request to use that water, and we can regulate it, which other states cannot because the way their laws are written. That's changed their constitution and rewriting laws, and you can imagine how difficult that would be in some of those states. But we have good laws. They tweak it a little bit, but we're not going to mess with it. I've been warned many times. But well, let's move on. We have localized situations. Saline contamination is what you'll see in the press and some documents. And that simply refers to the salts that include both uranium and other salts that are harmful to health. And they tell me, I did not see it personally, but if you go out into southeast Colorado, where they do a bunch of irrigating, they water their fields, and then when it dries up, the ground turns white with all these salts, to include uranium. And then when it does rain, it goes to the Arkansas River and then down into Kansas. And that's becoming a problem. Lakin was the first to find it. They dealt with it. The next town next to them, with only 300 people, they found uranium in their water. Lakin stepped up and said, we will provide you water. So they're putting in a water main all the way over to Deerfield. But we have to be aware, the next town in that line is Garden City. So we will be dealing with a fairly large problem here at some point. We also were informed in that meeting that now uranium salts have been found in the water in northwest Kansas as well. It's not all from the Arkansas River. The geologists explained to us in the committee that there is a layer of rock that contains uranium salts. And because the water levels are dropping, those are leaching out into the water supply now. So we need to stop the drop in that aquifer for a couple of reasons. One, to hold the uranium salts back and so forth. And there's other areas in the state, such as Wichita, that has problems with salt, just regular sodium chloride. Because of the salt deposits up north of them, that is starting to migrate towards their water supplies. They're doing some Herculean efforts to try to hold that salt plume back. Anyway, it's a fascinating field. A lot of things going on involving water. Now, number two here, we have wildlife preserves versus agriculture endeavors. Right now, there are lawsuits going on over the Covera bottoms and the Rattlesnake Creek area between the agriculture folks and the conservationists who want to save all that for the wildlife. As a committee, we will not be dealing with that because it's in the court system now. Then we have contamination for both industry, agriculture runoff, and urban rainwater runoff. And these are problems we need to be thinking about. And that is a constant process, and there is an office that watches all of that. Now we go beyond that, and we start looking at infrastructure challenges. In the municipalities, one thing we do know, that at some point, all of that underground water piping system will have to be replaced. It's been in there 100 years or more. It will have to be dealt with. So we have water storage facilities. We have wastewater treatment and the water treatment and the aging underground water lines and sewer systems. And in red, I wrote to myself, the cost for upgrading these systems could become an impediment for growth or even survival for smaller communities throughout our state. This is a problem, folks, and we will have to try to figure a way to deal with it. Which brings up the next big topic. Funding challenges. There is a water fund, and bless our hearts at the state level, we just never fund it completely. It's always underfunded. They come in and ask for 8 million every year, and we give them 2. And so a lot of these things cannot be done at this point without more funding. And we all know where the money's going. The education and social services. They're all important. And that money, we just don't have enough of it to go around. So what are we going to do? One person during the committee meeting in Garden City suggested charging a minimum fee for water by all consumers in the state. The chief engineer, I asked him how much water is consumed in our state on a yearly basis, and he came up with a number of 1.3 trillion gallons each year. So how much would we have to ask folks to chip in so that we can fund them adequately every year, plus develop a fund so that when, let's say my hometown, Brewster, comes in, 250 people, and says we need to upgrade and replace all the pipes in our town. And I would envision that fund, then it would be a cost share. Depending on how much you can pay, the fund will help, but you're going to have some skin in the game. If we don't, these communities are liable to go away simply because they cannot supply fresh water to the residents. We're not in crisis, but we need to be prepared. We don't want to end up in a situation that California and Arizona are in right now. So all of the committee has worked really hard, and I believe in the committee process. So we will be discussing this at great length in our committee to come up with solutions. And then at that point, we will ask the attorneys, the revisors, to put this all in a law so that we can bring it before the entire legislature. Any questions on water?
Just one, Ron. You mentioned a book. It's called Running Out.
Yes.
I Googled that while you were talking, and the only one that came up was a novel. So who's the author?
Bashir, Bessiare, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr.
It's
Chairman,
Running Out, and then I think there's a colon, The Search for Water in Western Kansas, something like that.
Thank you.
Excellent. It was good enough that I read it in 2 sittings, which is unusual. It was just a fascinating book.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
this is Jim Minix. You've done an excellent job of describing water issues. I might add slightly that some of these things are complicated by the regional approach. Things outside the state of Kansas, such as our water compacts. The compact with Colorado originally talked mainly about quantity and not the quality issues that we're having with the water at this time. You did a very good job of explaining things in as simply as possible, but it's an extremely complicated issue. But thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for that reminder. Folks, what Jim just said, Representative Minix from out at Scott City, it said, and I forgot to mention, but there's so many topics we can get into, but he talked about compacts. we have water compacts with Colorado, Nebraska, and I believe we have one with Oklahoma as well. These compacts are a document, a contract, if you will, that is written and has been written many, many, many years ago between states. And when this compact is written, it has to go before the US Congress for approval. So imagine trying to change a compact nowadays and getting it through Congress. Somewhere between difficult and impossible. But Representative Minix made the point. The Colorado Compact, at the point when they wrote it, they had no concept of water being contaminated. All water was fresh. Now it's contaminated. But in the compact, it uses the word quantity only. Now, the compacts we have with Nebraska, the newest one mentions quality as well. So those are important distinctions, but there are a lot of people trying to work within the compact to get this done without having to go through Congress. We'll see how it goes. There may be a lawsuit at some point, our state suing their state. You know how that goes. We just settled the ones with Colorado and Nebraska just recently. Anything more on water before we move on? Seen none. I was asked to give a talk in Emporia on the Constitution. Well, all 4 representatives and senator in that area were asked to give a talk. Well, I knew they were going to cover the big topics in constitutions. So I chose a different tack. There are words that are being used by folks that I'm a little concerned about. And quite frankly, I wasn't sure of their meaning. So I did my own research. And here's a few of the examples. Freedom versus liberty. What's the difference? And you see there, freedom is predominantly an internal construct. And Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, wrote a book. And within that book, he said, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way in how he approaches circumstances. And that to me is a really good definition of freedom. You have to take ownership of what goes on between your ears. That's your freedom. And liberty is predominantly an external construct. It's the state of being free within a society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority or one's way of life, behavior, or political views. Those are liberties that you find within your society. Now, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but I found it kind of fascinating. Our founding fathers, they went one step further, noted the distinction between negative and positive liberties. And then they codified those differences in the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Positive liberties, and this is kind of backwards thinking, but bear with me. Positive liberties require others to provide you with either a good or a service. This includes taking one from someone else to provide the good or service to another. Negative liberties require that others abstain from interfering with your actions. The Bill of Rights is a document of negative liberties. These are the liberties that shall not be hampered in any way. Then we go on to another one that's been bugging me for quite a while, but I finally took the time to do the research. Differences between a right and a privilege. Rights are not conferred by anyone, and they cannot be taken away or altered by anyone. They are inherent. They are natural or God-given. The Constitution does not exist to give us rights, but to protect the rights we are born with. And that's how it was designed. Privileges, on the other hand, do not belong to all. They are given to some and withheld from others. They are unequal by nature. It's just the way it is. Often, a privilege involves taking something from one group and giving it to another. Prime examples of this: taxes are collected to support welfare, education, medical care, you name it, all these things, free education. Now, because it's a privilege, it can be altered, changed, or even withheld. A driver's license is a privilege. You can think of all kinds of things that are privileges. We're hearing the words that these things now have been changed to a right. But that is not what the founders intended, and I'm going to stick with the meanings as they should be used. Rights exist outside government, and privileges exist within government. Just to clarify it a little more, but rights cannot exist without government. There are no rights in an anarchy. And you've seen examples of that in some of these cities where they had a total breakdown in society, anarchy, if you will. The privilege of having an ambulance come to you was not allowed in those areas. They were blocked from coming in. There was no law. There was no government. It was a mess. So we do have to have government. And our government was set up to protect both our rights, and that was the primary design. And those that weren't given to the federal government belonged to the state. And we need to remember that. But one thing, as I read through all of this research, one thing that kept coming up over and over again, one very important principle overlooked is that in our form of government, personal responsibility is key. If you are not personally involved, because our government is built from the individual up, not the top down. And if the individuals no longer care or are involved in their government, then we will have a problem. It's a personal responsibility. That's part of our government, the way it was designed. Now, it seems silly, but the words shall, will, may, and must are bandied around about. In fact, we argued for 2 hours one night on the floor in the House whether the word in the bill should be shall or may. At that time, I believe shall meant you will. But in my research, I found that shall is confusing because in our vernacular today, it can mean may, will, or must. Must is a word of obligation, and must not is also a word of obligation. So they are clear. The U.S. Supreme Court, well, let's go back. Brian Garner, the editor of Black's Law Dictionary, this is a dictionary that attorneys use. Like in my practice, I had a medical dictionary. They have a law dictionary. The editor said shall is the most litigated word in the English language. So there's a red flag right there. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the word shall, when it appears in statutes, it means may. So we have problems in our statutes and we have problems in our regulations because these words appear quite often. The word shall appears in the Bill of Rights and their intent is clear. It means must. For the meaning of the words in those days. Now let's go to the Kansas Constitution. There's Senate Bill 95 passed 2015 out of the legislature and signed into law. And immediately litigation began the next year. This is the abortion law that we passed. Here, I read through the opinion piece, the opinion that the Supreme Court judges wrote. And here's some of the things they cited within that opinion. They said the Bill of Rights and the Kansas Constitution is stronger even than the U.S. 14th Amendment. And that's the due process clause in the Constitution. That the Bill of Rights give personal autonomy. And because the Kansas Bill of Rights appear first in the state constitution, they are the most important part of the Constitution. And you can imagine my confusion when I read their opinion. But so I said, I want to find out if those words appear in our Constitution. So I did a word search in the Kansas Constitution. The words abortion and personal autonomy do not appear in our state constitution. So I just said, well, let's look into this a little more. What does personal autonomy mean? It's a concept of self-government, essentially the notion that humans are, or most properly ought to be, self-governed or self-directed in terms of their choices, their actions, and the direction of their lives. Distinguish this from freedom. One is free if there are no external constraints on one's actions. There are conditions to achieve true autonomy. According to, I got this information from a law review article. They're psychological, and an individual actively assess their environment and the choices available and do so in a rational and non-self-deceptive manner. So don't deceive yourself. Get all the facts on the table. And the other condition is social. I mean, there are two of those. The autonomous individual must have a legitimate range of alternative actions from which to choose. The individual's choices must not be overly restricted by others. And within that law review article I mentioned, this came from the Marshall Law Review article. If an individual's choices are determined purely by their economics or bodily needs, in other words, they are not autonomous. For those reasons, I voted for the constitutional amendment will appear next November on the ballot and allow the people to decide if we want to put in our Constitution clear words that state that abortion is not a right in our state. So that you'll hear more about as time goes on before the election. And that, folks, ends the information from your guest speaker. And the guest speaker now asks if there are any more questions.
Ron?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just have a clarification on that book on the water, because I quick looked it up for the lady. It's called Running Out in Search of Water in the High Plains. It's Lucas is the first name of the individual. The SSI on Amazon for $20 hardcover. That's it.
Right. That's it. That's it. Excellent book. Excellent book. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Oklahoma. But he grew up in that part of the state, and it's a fascinating read, and he really outlines the problems there, and it's great. I wholly recommend it. I can't say enough about the author and his book. And he's offered to help us write how we're going to educate the public on this issue. You know, some of us are straightforward, but we need to talk about this with the public in a manner that is easily understood, but not frighten people, if you know what I'm saying. We have to handle it carefully, but we need to bring awareness.
Alan
Any other
Harvey, I
questions?
just want to thank you for the time you've taken. We really appreciate the opportunity to hear this.
Thank you, Vi. I appreciate that. It's a labor of love. These questions bug me, so I have to do the research and find out for myself. And that's, that's what you do up here. You try to represent people the best you can and help everyone you can. And last year, that's been a big one with the labor issues, but we do what we can. Any other questions before we sign off? Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. Have a great day and a great week. We finally got some rain.
Okay, thanks, Ron.
Bye.
Let's see, how do we get out of here?